Okay, so hello everyone. Yeah, to make matters clear, because I got quite a few questions yesterday. No, I'm not from Wargaming, the company, but I work with Wargaming as a method. So let's get this straight from the beginning. Yeah. I'm Pijus, and I'm from ISM University of Management and Economics, where I've talked a bit more about what we're doing. But I want to start with, first of all, sort of setting the stage before I talk about myself and what we're doing, and then getting to my topic today, that's merging theme and mechanics, and what lessons we can learn, again, from Wargaming, the method, instead of the company. So my main line of work relates to board games. And when it comes to board games, the first things that you create a picture for yourself when talking about it is, some counters, a board probably, unless it's a purely card game, some dice if it involves luck, some cards if it involves cards. So some very, very basic stuff: board, cards, dice, meeples, counters, whatever. But board games can also be a powerful tool in terms of modeling our reality. And that's what I want to talk about, how these cardboard things can become representations of reality, which are also immersive and allows us to, better understand the world that's surrounding us. And if we have immersion, then players will have immersion as well. So I'll take the perspective of war games and, or simulationist board games as models of our reality. And just to illustrate some examples, so as I work at the university, what we have, one of the things is a wargaming course for students, where students develop their own games throughout the course of the semester. And those games need to simulate some political or economic process. So the students are in the political economy program, that's their topic, so they need to simulate politics or economics through a medium of a board game. So that's just examples from the last spring of the games we had. For example, the resource politics in the Niger Republic, where we're currently having a conflict between the local government, the French as a former colonial power, as well as the United States, which has a base there, I believe, but I don't think they have any more. We also talked about or modeled medieval warfare. We modeled economics of the 90s with the privatization, racketeering, and whatnot, everything the wild 90s involved. And we've also talked about political institutions and how board games as a medium can teach about the workings of political institutions. And in that case specifically, it was about elections and electoral systems. So so that's basically one of the things I do. I graduated on political science and then did my PhD in economics. Started teaching at the uni at ISM in 2012, so it's already the 13th year, I think, that I'm doing this. But since 2020, we've introduced the wargaming course for students to develop their own thematic games. And then we've started this September a Wargaming Lab, again, not affiliated to the company, the Wargaming as a Method Lab, where we are planning to extend our board game simulation activities within and also outside of the university. So, but coming back to the topic of my speech today, so why theme and mechanics, and why I want to talk about them and how the board games can actually serve as a tool for creativity, whether you're working on the board game medium or a digital medium, is that, how theme connects to mechanics helps immerse players into the game and the game world that you have. It helps structure the narrative so that instead of purely a mathematical thing or mathematical model, you have a story built around that, even if there's math all behind it. And, again, as I work at the university, one thing that's important for me is learning what creating games or playing games can also teach. And I think that's where this connection or marriage between theme and mechanics becomes a very, very important factors. So the outline of the argument I'm making today is that first, board games constraints that they have can also be an advantage. Second is war games or conflict simulations are especially good at thematic representations, and we'll look at some examples. And focus choices strengthen the narrative, as a board game has limited space and limited can require only limited capacity of players involved. You have to focus the game of some specific arguments you are making, and that can also be an advantage in merging theme and mechanics. And therefore, the final sort of a conclusion that I am trying to advocate for is that these limitations can lead to creativity that then can be transferred to other media. So, first of all, analog versus digital. I think that's one of the more important questions. And also that's a question that I usually get during my first class of the semester when I teach the course, is why are we focusing on analog medium instead of a digital one? So digital definitely has a lot of advantages, from visualization to working with, well, huge amounts of data, which board games definitely cannot. They can tell very well-structured and diverging narratives and so on. So digital games definitely have their role and they have their own advantages. But what could be the advantages of analog games? Anyone? As a lecturer, I'm always trying to, make others speak so that I don't have to. So, sorry? Okay, tactile feeling. Okay, thank you. That's one good point. What else? Yeah, please. Okay. Yeah, interaction between players that you see face to face instead of just virtually. Okay, anything else? Yeah, so you get really a focused view on something instead of something that can involve a lot of things. Now, additionally, why I think analog can also serve as a good example of merging theme and mechanics, especially when it comes to learning, is that first you have to fully understand what you are doing. I mean, of course, whenever you are playing the game for the first time, you didn't really listen to whoever was explaining that, so you pick it up as you go. But if you want to play a board game properly, and a board war game, you have to understand how it works. Otherwise, it's just, random dice rolls or whatever. It's not a game anymore. With a computer game, you can sort of try to do learning by clicking, which is not really applicable here. So you have to understand the model behind the rules in the case of a board game, and it has to be focused enough so that the player can have the enough capacity to actually pick up and play the game. So that's one of the core elements, that we have to develop a model and that players are required to understand it by nature of the medium. Now, secondly, why war games as opposed to Euro games? So we could also add the Ameritrash games, skipping those for now. So the core difference that I would argue is that most of the Euro games, so basically those are the games where you try to build an engine and to optimize the engine, with an example being here is a Brass Birmingham game. So I like both war games and Euro games. I'm not trying to pile on this, but I think that there, in the case of Euro games, it's a lot more about mechanics. The focus is on the mechanics first, and the theme comes second. There are some connections, but they're mostly Chrome or just a pasted-on theme. And now imagine who has played Seven Wonders as a board game. Okay, several hands raised. Basically what you do, it's a card-based game where you draft cards, you select your cards, and you supposedly build one of the wonders of the world, of the ancient world. Now, do you actually learn anything about building those? No, not at all. You just still build a market or do some battling, but that has no relation to the actual topic that the game has. Now, in the case of war games, what we have is that the start and the beginning of the work on a war game is the theme. So what do I want to represent? Not, I have some cool mechanics in my mind, I'll develop a game, and then I'll find a theme that fits it. But I have a theme that I want to represent. And to do that, I need to find mechanics that would allow me to simulate the theme, to tell something about the theme, rather than just show off what cool mechanics I've come up with this time. And that's why I think war games are basically just an alternative way of modeling social reality. There are different approaches in social sciences. There are game theory, which is basically just math which is applied, but is technically just mathematics. There are agent-based models. There are all different kinds of models. But what does a model do generally? Not necessarily social sciences, not necessarily natural science, but what should a good model do? Predict. One, predict something that is going to happen based on the data that you gathered. Thank you. What else? Sorry? Okay, representation. Okay, prediction, representation. Simplifying, yeah. You can't, I mean, if you have a model that's as complex as reality, you just created another reality. Yeah, you have to simplify things. And one other thing that at least in social sciences, a model has the purpose of is explaining the process, how we get to some stage. Whether it's a real stage, existing stage, or a non-existing stage, it doesn't matter. Just like yesterday, we ran a war game with my students about defense of Marijampolė, a town. Well, somebody was attacking, somebody was defending. But the end state that we wanted to simulate is either a loss or successful defense of the town. Okay? What the game then does is models the process of how we are getting there step by step. Instead of just, again, starting from the mechanics, you have first the topic, yeah, defense, you have two outcomes, and these outcomes must be explained by the mechanics that a game model has in it. So basically, my proposition is that, yeah, a war game is basically this model that, whereas Euro games are more of those pure mathematical models that engage mathematics of the mechanics first, rather than theme, and build a model around the theme and the process that leads to an end state of the game or the different end states that could emerge. So yeah, theme first. And if you have a theme first, you also have to very clearly define agency. Now again, the agency in other types of board games, non-war games, can be a bit washed out, so you're not really sure as a player whom you are representing. Here, in case of these simulationist board games, agency is one of the key questions that you have to answer first as a designer. So you have a theme, you know what kind of process you want to model, but what you have to do then is decide, okay, so who is the player going to be? So is the player the government? Is the player a sergeant who is leading a squad? Or who is the player in the game? And that's all before selecting the actual mechanics. If I know who my players are, then I will know several things. So what they want to achieve in real life, what they would want to achieve. Second, what would be their actions that they could take to achieve this, or ends, means, and other limitations. So basically the challenges that each actual agent would face, the agent that the players represent. So then you have sort of this extension of the theme, and you can start thinking how mechanics can start representing that. Not, again, starting from the mechanics, but starting from the theme. And we'll go through an example quite soon of how this actually works, and just of me talking quite abstractly. So first, you select what and how to represent, starting with the what, getting to the how, instead of how and getting to decide what it tries to represent. So we'll do a case study, a brief case study based on 3 games. Now, war games have long been used since the start of the 19th century by military planners and governments to, well, plan potential scenarios of what's going to happen in the future. But we'll take a look at 3 commercially available board-based war games, and we'll do a study of time on battlefield. So that's one very specific aspect of a battle, time, how we can understand it. So what are the challenges if you want to model time? So what could be the challenges of including it in your war game? I mean, time definitely has to be there. Yeah, so one question is, okay, so how much time will one turn of the game model? Okay, thank you. Yeah. Okay, how do you manage time between different units, especially thinking of board games now? It's still I go, you go, instead of we both go at the same time, mostly. Okay, what else? Okay, so a lot happens in the time that we decide to allocate to one term, and what can happen in that short period of time. So we'll focus on 3 games. The first is ASL. It's not H-sex location. It says Advanced Squad Leader, which was it's sort of already a reiteration of an earlier game published in 1985. It still has a huge fan community. Some hate it, some like it. It's sort of a, there's no in between. You either hate it or you love it. The second game is a bit later from GMT. That's Combat Commander Europe. And the third one is an even newer one called The Last 100 Yards. All of these games are quite similar in terms of what they are modeling. So they're modeling squad-level conflict, squad-level battle, with, of course, 2 end states that you can either achieve your objectives or you lose. Just the way that they model the actual process of what's happening in a game is quite different from one to another. So, time on a battlefield, what would happen, time in a board game, and how we manage that. And we'll base our idea on Foley's 2016 article. Has anybody read Zones of Control? It's a good book. You can look it up. I know it's recently been on sale on Humble Bundle, so it might get there back again sometime. But what he basically proposes is that we have 3 different concepts of time in the game. The first one is actual time, so the time that we want to model, within the battle. So those generally the length of the battle we are modeling. Second is the model time, or how much the one turn takes. The third one is the design time. So once we decide how much a one turn takes, we still likely need to subdivide it into different phases of how we are modeling different things, because if we look at a battle, a lot of things can happen in the time allocated. All of these games that we're looking at, they have time scale between about 2 and 5 minutes. So one turn represents only 2 or 5 minutes of the actual battle, but still a lot of things can happen. First, you can rally troops that are currently disoriented or fatigue or whatever happened to them. Maybe their guns broke or many other things that you need to solve. Need to do preparatory fire and keep the enemy suppressed so that they cannot actually move on you. Then you need to move. Then you need to fire if you are defending, etc. So a lot of things are happening in those 2 to 5 minutes, and you somehow need to model them using a board game as a medium. Each game, because you have to focus a board game very specifically, approaches the same problem of time quite differently. So the first is the Advanced Squad Leader, which says, okay, so one turn is exactly 2 minutes. You already get the precision. There is no blurred lines. It's 2 minutes sharp. And actually, one of the first games already that were created for the military use, the Kriegspiel, also looked at 2 minutes as a time turn. So it's sort of a bit of a standard already. And what it has is detailed phasing. So what happens after what? You start with rallying, you then do the preparatory fire, movement, then the defender can fire a moving troop. So basically there's a very clear order in what is happening. What it simulates in this way is a very clear, what it provides in this case is a very clear representation of doctrine. So if you take military doctrine, that's basically something that you get in the battle sequence for, or a turn sequence for the Advanced Squad Leader game. So it's basically a one-to-one of a doctrine and what we would expect. So it's doctrine focused. Now, I could also ask if that's something that you would expect to happen on the battlefield, or what could be the limitations of this approach. Yep, please. Okay, so there can be variations between different troops, and there are different armies, in what they're using. Okay, then there's a famous quote that, no plan survives the first contact with the enemy. And this is very much where the plan, well, partly at least stands till the end of the turn, because you have all these phases to go through. So what it doesn't have at all, or at least to a way lower extent, is chaos. I mean, on the battlefield, you don't really have time within 2 minutes to do everything all at once, or is in a board game, one thing after another. So this is what the game, the Combat Commander game, tries to look at. Okay, so we have one view, 2 minutes, and that's it. And you do all of the sub-phases that you would expect to do according to the doctrine. So here the game says, okay, let's get rid of the phases, because in the chaos of the battle, you wouldn't be thinking about it. Okay? Technically, looking at what would happen as a agent making decisions, a sergeant, let's say, you would have all of these different options to do that at one squad leader offers. Okay? So in that sense, you could say that it's more realistic. On the other hand, you would have a lot of chaos and no way to think of that and about it all. So Combat Commander, what it does, it says, okay, let's get rid of the phases and instead give the cards. So as a player representing the agent, the sergeant, you just get a hand of cards, and this tells you what actions and reactions you can do. So you don't have the full scale subphase after subphase of selection, but you just have some choices. Like it can be 2 cards in some scenario, basically giving you 2 options of what you can do. One of them is a rubbish card you can't use anyway, and the second one you want to keep for later, and suddenly you do nothing. So it's not as smooth then as the first model of time on the battlefield. On the other hand, what it accounts for is the chaos that you would have, and also the pauses. It's not that a battle is constant movement of everything. Pauses happen, and this game has it. The previous one, not so much. So basically, yeah, chaos, and that's one of the key focuses here. Now, the third game, the most recent one, the last 100 years, it still interprets time a bit differently compared to the 2 previous games. So first, it still has phases, but they're constructing around actions and reactions. So one player acts, the other can react, then the originally acting player can react, and so on. But this also doesn't give a clear indication of how much time we're simulating, how much time, how many minutes we're actually simulating. So what happens here is that the designer's argument is that the perception of time would actually be non-fully linear for an actual soldier or a squad based in the combat zone. And what would happen is that maybe something would happen very quickly, or maybe the same action could take way more time from one turn to another. So what he does is basically randomizes time passage. So you roll a die, which affects, whether it's what's the minimum? Yeah, whether it's 2 minutes or 5 minutes. And the battle ends after a certain time. So you actually don't know exactly how long you have to achieve the objectives. Well, there is a range that you can sort of calculate, but still, focusing on the individual experience of time, this can change dramatically even if you're replaying the same scenario from one case to another. So even if we're just looking at these 3 games, and very, very specific point, they're similar in many ways in terms of topic theme, each of them still has to make a choice for each thematic element that they're making. As in this case, we have looked at time and how they deal with time. Now, what of it, you might ask, and that would be a good question and a very timely question. And my proposal is here that by playing war games, due to their focus and the medium that they have, we can also learn to engage the topics more creatively, or to engage the topics through mechanics a bit more creatively. So to summarize, the argument is, that analog format requires first the understanding of underlying model. So as a player, you need to understand the model, which helps with the immersion of participating in the game. they can create a narrative sandbox. So Wargame is definitely not so much of a story-driven game like some of the Ameritrash games would be if we're talking about board games. But it creates a sandbox where you can explore different narratives and how they structure, for example, the battle as we looked at. And they provide different thematic points of view that can give you ideas about how you can understand time in battle, understand politics, understand economics, and many other things, just by focusing sharply on specific aspects of the reality that they're trying to represent. Prior to playing the games, I haven't really been thinking about, okay, time in the battle is, something very clear. Then you take one game system, another game system, the third one, and you understand that maybe there's actually way more to this one specific aspect of battle than you would have thought otherwise. So, summarize it. Thanks for listening. I'm very open to any questions you might have. If you want to keep in touch, there's some information. I'm always happy to talk about wargaming in general, board gaming specifically, teaching, using games, and all the other things. So feel free to reach out, and yeah, I'm happy to stay in touch with. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yes, we have quite plenty of time for questions.
Hello, thank you. Is it purely entertainment, or this could be applied to predicting real-world scenarios?
It is being used by the both by militaries and civilian officers, government officers broadly. So for a long time, it's very much used in the Anglo-Saxon world. It's being more picked up also in Western Europe currently, also through NATO initiatives. So it is being used and quite heavily. Of course, many of the games are classified, not so you can't actually use everything. But for example, the game that we demonstrated yesterday, and then I have for now at the tabletop corner of the expo, it's been used for learning purposes by our ally infantry divisions. Not so much as an analytical or a predictive tool, but as a learning tool to structure the planning of urban operations in this case. But it's also been used for predictive purposes, yeah, the method itself.
Thank you. Do we have more people? Yes, thank you.
Is it necessary to create a new wargame model to model certain modern scenarios, or can pre-existing wargames be available for consumers or relatively easily acquirable? Can they be used?
Yeah, so one of my favorite stories, and I told it yesterday to you, so if you were yesterday, just bear with me for a moment. So in 1990, Iraq attacks Kuwait, and so United States has to decide on the response. Now, response calculation costs a lot if you use computers. It's still 1990, so it also takes time. So what they're looking for is a solution they could quickly use to help inform different level officers of potential scenarios that could unfold and potential involvement. And what they get, one of the things that they get is a board game, a commercial board game called Gulf Strike by I think it's Mike Herman game. And they actually use that commercial game for the initial response analysis. I mean, not full planning, it has enough detail and it has a good enough model for the actual officers to use. And talking about series in general, I think that's an interesting question because there are, for example, if we look at commercially available war games, there is a series of games called Coin, so it's counterinsurgency, where usually one player takes the role of the government and players are working to undermine it to an extent at least, representing different counterinsurgent factions. But what it has is that the same system and underlying logic of how counterinsurgency works in general, within the series it has been transported to the Gallic Wars led by Julius Caesar to modern Afghanistan. So the same model with modifications, of course, because you have a different theme. So you need to represent what's different, but on the same basic structure, yeah, you can expand and then you can have a whole series. I think it has about 15 or so games currently, just reaching a wide variety of counterinsurgent topics. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Somebody else maybe? Oh, good.
Thank you for the talk. Honestly, that's not what I expected when I came here, but I'm glad I stayed. It's pretty cool what you're doing. And my question is more about you. Like, how did you go from social sciences and economics and getting a PhD in that into board games and yeah, what you talked about now? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm glad you stayed as well. I always played board games. I started with the role-playing games. The Warhammer Fantasy role-playing game was my first ever game that I had. And then, apart from Monopoly types. But then I've read Phil Saban's book. So he's a professor at King's College. He was a professor at King's College called Simulating War. And in the book, in addition to just talking more about wargaming, what he has several examples how he simply took a 52 card deck of cards and tried to model a standard Napoleonic battle, or well, what could be a standard Napoleonic battle, just using standard deck of cards. And that's got me thinking, okay, maybe I could start using games also in my teaching. So I started to introduce simple games, like in the comparative politics course, we have a class on revolutions of, okay, so can I use cards to illustrate the models that I'm teaching of how revolutions happen? And yeah, I came up with a way, and then I thought, maybe it's an interesting thing to pursue more. And then I got into historical hobby war games, and I saw, okay, this actually can have way more applications. And then bit by bit, I've got more and more into it. Thank you.
Thanks. There was somebody near the front question or not?
So I'm interested, how much did war games influence board games in general? As in those that were used by the military, how much of them influenced the history of board games themselves?
Okay, that's a good question, and it might be a bit difficult to answer, but there definitely has been a connection. If you look at development of D&D and Gary Gygax, they've definitely been influenced by commercially available war games. So basically for commercially available board games, it's 1950s when you have a proper board game scene emerging around Avalon Hill Company. And then a lot of these the designers of then different genres have had one way or another been exposed to it. And yeah, at least for Gygax, definitely there's been a connection of picking up ideas from war games and just, making it about fantasy, and then it goes on and on and on and develops into what we have now as role-playing games. So there has definitely been a connection. For connection between professional war games and commercial war games, it's sort of a bit blurred area, as there is. So one of the first designers, Charles Roberts, he did develop the standard combat ratio of what you get as a defender, what you get as an attacker, in terms of force composition to make it equal. So the advantage of the defender. And one of the stories, the anecdote, so I cannot be sure if it's true or not, goes that he was invited by Rand Corporation to talk about it. And Rand Corporation is basically one of the key think tanks in foreign policy in the US. And they asked, we also have sort of come up with a similar thing. So did you really come up with it yourself or not? And so on and so on. And then the story also goes that he also notices them using a hexagon grid for the maps to better represent movement, and then he transforms it into, or takes it and uses it also in commercial board gaming. Well, those might be a bit apocryphal stories, I think every genre builds a mythology around itself as well. Thank you.
Thanks. Let me see if more people have questions. Yeah, or maybe you can remind, or if you mentioned maybe yesterday or not, about the podcast from Lituanicon, where you did an interview.
Yeah, so I also talked about wargaming at Lituanicon, so sci-fi and fantasy convention we had just a week ago, so it's event after event after event, and it's a part also of our Kavinė fantastiška, sorry, it's in Lithuanian, a podcast thing that we have, and we'll have it quite soon. I think we are not on yet, but it will soon be available. I think the colleagues have just fixed the sound things, and we'll have it on next week. It should be out already, so you can talk about wargaming more generally, a bit more. Less about time on the battlefield, more about what wargaming is and how it is used, and some of the connections with science fiction and aliens.
It was a very great interview for me. I'm not following this topic very closely, but I mentioned that I will start to follow at least one subset with the climate, which kind of hooked me. So yeah, I guess thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Great to hear always from you, and hope we'll meet in more events.
I'm sure we will. Thank you, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks.